So the conversation lately has been on different strategies for collecting qualitative information, whether that's interviews or focus groups or doing field work. And we're going to start transitioning into a conversation about what do you do with that qualitative information? How do you use that? How do you analyze that? How do you present that in a way that is useful and compelling? And one of the strategies that gets used, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about archival information, is to use a case study research design. And there's a lot that goes into case study research designs. It's been incredibly well studied. It's a core qualitative research method, but I've found that it's useful to kind of separate out research designs that are aimed at establishing causality or serve a research purpose versus case study designs that are more of management tools. And so we'll talk about those two separately, but I'm going to start with talking about case study designs as research tools. So a case study design, particularly if you're looking at just a single case study, and we'll talk about a comparative design a little bit later on, but a single case study design could be done for a variety of reasons that might serve a researcher's interest. So it might be that we just need to do a descriptive case study. I want to understand a particular case. It's interesting to me. I'm curious about it. My boss asked me to study it. I got a grant to study a particular case. I have to write up a report, and part of that grant or part of that report is to provide analysis of the situation. So sometimes we're just trying to describe for other people to provide them a picture of what's happening because we're interested in that for one reason or another. Some case studies are done for hypothesis generation. So there's something really weird about this one case. It's performing really well or really poorly. And I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around that. And as part of trying to wrap my head around that, I'm going to do analysis of that situation, that case. I'm going to look at documents. I'm going to talk to people. Maybe I'll do some focus groups. Maybe I'll read up on the history of it. However, I'm sort of doing that analysis. And the goal is to kind of generate different ideas, different hypotheses about what could explain that kind of weird outcome. And then I can sort of use those and go and test those elsewhere to see, so is that really what's driving this weird, wacky outcome, or is it something else? So we can use it to kind of do maybe that inductive kind of process of helping to generate ideas about how the world might work. And then lastly, we can do case study analysis to try to nail down causality. And there's a lot that's been written on this because while it can be done and while it can be a powerful tool, it's hard to do this well. And so we'll talk about some of that as we go through here. I kind of pulled together this, well, I didn't even pull together, I made it up. This is a completely fictitious graph, but it helped me to kind of think about what these different kind of case studies might look like. And so this is again, made up data looking at organization turnover. So basically, employees, whether they stay working for an organization, and the average employee stress rating. So do people find their job to be stressful or not? And so in my sort of proposed relationship of what this might look like, jobs that are very high stress have very high turnover. And there are cases that follow that pattern. In fact, I've got an arrow pointing to a typical organization. And maybe if I was just trying to understand what that process looks like of stress and turnover, maybe I would go to a typical organization, one that's sort of smack dab on that line, and sort of study that to sort of see how that plays out. And presumably there are people in that organization who are thinking about leaving. I could talk to them about their stress level, if that's a factor, and maybe that would be a way to analyze that question. I'm not sure that that's maybe the best way to get at causal relationships. And I'm not really sure that's the best way to generate hypotheses looking at that case. But maybe if we're trying to figure out, do I understand that process correctly, I should be looking at where things are sort of behaving normally to see if things play out more or less as I expected. Maybe I'm interested in a case that's not on the line, but I care about it because it's my organization, right? That would be just a descriptive case study. I want to know about this case for my own personal reasons. Or I've got that sort of really wacky case, which might work as a hypothesis generation case because it's an outlier, it's unusual. So the point here is that case studies aren't just sort of an in-depth analysis, they're an in-depth analysis that we're conducting for a particular reason, for a particular purpose. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, that a case study is never done in isolation. It's always done sort of in relationship to my own research needs, or in relationship to theory. I'm interested in this case because it doesn't behave the way theory tells me it should, or I'm interested in this case because it behaves exactly the way theory tells me it should. And so a lot of what makes cases interesting isn't just sort of their natural sort of interestingness, it's how they relate to what we think we know about the world. And I think that's a useful place to maybe shift this conversation over to thinking about causality. I'm skipping through a couple different case study designs because I've talked them through in the past, and they tend to cause stress for folks because they tend to be more abstract. If you are interested in case study designs and how to do this really well and how to nail down causality with a single case study design, I'm happy to send folks resources or point them in the right direction. But I think that those methods tend to be problematic. The comparative method, which we'll talk about in some depth, is also problematic, but problematic in ways that I think we can maybe work with and manage. So if you're interested in establishing causality using the case study method, you probably want to use some version of a comparative case design. So this is not using just a single case, but this is using using two or more cases to try to figure out how things work. And so I think most intuitive form of the comparative case design is what we might call the most similar case. And if you recall back to the discussion we had on testing and fair housing and how those tests were set up, Angela Harrison Erlacher described sort of creating two situations in which she had testers that were identical on every single dimension, their credit history, their lending, whether they were pre-approved for a mortgage, age, or all these different factors. But then she would vary one factor related to a particular tester to see if they would receive different treatment when they went in to inquire about renting an apartment or when they made a phone call asking about a mortgage. So that's essentially the logic of the most similar case design, where we have two cases that are basically identical. They're identical in every possible way, except they have a different outcome. And if they have a different outcome, then we can sort of look at that and say, well, there's got to be something there that explains that different outcome. What is something that's different in these two cases? And we can start going through and say, oh, no, they're similar. Aha, here's something else that looks different. That's a prime candidate for explaining why these two cases that are otherwise identical have a divergent outcome. And this is something that was articulated by John Stuart Mill back in the 19th century as a way to sort of think about causality in the sciences. He proposed a second technique that I'll sort of flag as well, and then we can talk about why this is maybe a really tricky thing to set up in the social sciences. So the second method that John Stuart Mill proposed, and this is also a comparative case design, where we can look at two cases and possibly figure out what's the causal link driving things. And the second method is the most different case. And so in this case, you're not looking at two cases that have different outcomes. I think I had X and Y before. Here you're looking for two cases that have the same outcome, but are otherwise completely different. They're different on every possible dimension. And because they're different on every possible dimension, we can sort of go through those dimensions and say, well, that can't explain why they have the same outcome. And that can't explain why they have the same outcome. And you start working through all the possible explanations for what could be leading these cases to the same outcome until you find one thing that's in common. And that one thing that's in common is the thing that must be driving the common outcome, because it couldn't be anything else, right? There's too much variation. They're too divergent in those different ways. The strength of a comparative case study design, whether it's the most similar case study design where you have two cases that are basically identical and you found different outcomes and one other factor, or this most different case design where you have cases that are not related in any way and yet somehow ended up at the same place. The strength of either of those designs rests on finding cases that line up just perfectly. And that's really hard to do. The world isn't designed to make life easy for the social scientist. There's massive complexity out there, and we can't possibly find cases that fit perfectly. In fact, John Stuart Mill was quite skeptical that this was a strategy that could be used in the social sciences. He sort of proposed it for the natural sciences and said, well, maybe chemistry or physics work this way, but social sciences are really messy. And yet, social scientists have grabbed onto the comparative method as a tool for understanding and thinking about causality. And so I think it's worth having a brief conversation about how do we deal with these imperfect designs? Like if you're trying to establish a causal link, how do you do that in a world that's not giving you cases that are perfect? Again, remember in the testing scenario that was described by High Plains Fair Housing, they're able to create two situations that are otherwise the same because they're able to create sort of fictitious people that they're able to send out to do investigations and testing. In the social sciences, we don't oftentimes have that luxury of being able to sort of generate cases. We have to deal with what's sort of given to us. And if we're not finding cases that line up perfectly, we have essentially two strategies. So one strategy is to say, well, I can't get the kind of variation that I need in just looking at two cases. So I'm going to look at a third case. And I'll give you an example on this. So Aaron Leipart, a famous comparative political scientist, wrote an article on using the comparative method in political science. And he talked about how a really useful, potentially, comparative case study design would be to compare North Dakota and Manitoba. And he said North Dakota and Manitoba are very similar. Inhospitable climate, brutalizingly flat, similar settlement patterns of migration coming in. Even the indigenous communities, there was considerable movement across the border between the Lakota and the Métis, and so very similar kind of history, but they're on either side of the US-Canadian border. And so they've got that thing different. And he said, well, that's a really interesting case where you have two situations that are very similar, but they have a different sort of political system that they're operating in. That might be a useful comparative case study design. But if you know anything about North Dakota, and if you know anything about Manitoba, there is one thing that's kind of glaringly different, and that is that Manitoba has a great big city in it called Winnipeg, and North Dakota doesn't. In fact, Winnipeg has about as many people in it as the entire state of North Dakota. And so while North Dakota is a very rural state, Manitoba has an urban population center. And so I would be hesitant to draw any serious conclusions about any sort of social outcome between North Dakota versus Winnipeg based on just knowing that one's in Canada and one's in the United States, because it could also be urbanization versus a more rural, less urbanized environment. But Minnesota has a large city. Minnesota has things that are kind of similar to North Dakota and kind of similar to Manitoba, but also has the benefit of being in the United States, similar to North Dakota, large metropolitan area, Minneapolis-St. Paul area, similar to Winnipeg in Manitoba. And so we could maybe use those three cases and say, well, I'm not getting the exact variation that I want with these two, but by adding in a third, I can kind of tease out sort of how these different things factor in and play out. So that's one strategy. I don't have to look at just two cases. I can look at two or three or four or five or six. And hopefully if I get a handful of cases, I'll be able to get the kind of variation that I need to be able to say, well, even though the things aren't lining up perfectly, I can kind of look at this pair of cases and this pair of cases and kind of rule out different explanations. That's one strategy. A second strategy is to just use our sort of analytic powers to conduct what are sometimes called counterfactual analyses to say, here are the 6 things in these 2 cases that are different and that could potentially be confounding factors. And I'm just going to consider each of them in turn. And I'm going to look at them and say, in this situation, I know that North Dakota doesn't have a large city like Winnipeg, but I don't think the outcome of interest that I'm curious about is related to urbanization. And here's why. And maybe I make reference to other research that's been done on urbanization. Maybe I do sort of my own sort of thought experiment about what would happen if you threw a major city in the heart of North Dakota. Maybe I do something where I just kind of try to tell myself the story about how these things could be causally related, and it doesn't seem to be a story that really makes sense. And so for each of those factors that's different, I can do that analysis. I can talk it through. I can make, if I'm persuasive, right, and I can say there's no reason to think these things are causally related. Maybe I can rule that out as a potential explanation, even though my case study design didn't give me that pairing the way that I might have wanted it to have a better, more perfect comparative case study method.